Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Changing Minds podcast. This is me, Owen Fitzpatrick, and I'm delighted to be joined by a wonderful friend of mine, Robbie Crabtree. Let me just tell you a little bit about this man that I'll be speaking to you today. You're going to be ridiculously impressed when I share with you who he is. And also, we're going to be talking about one of my favorite topics in the world. So I've been looking forward to this for weeks. I cannot wait to nerd out all around about storytelling with my good friend Robbie. So Robbie Crabtree has served many entrepreneurial endeavors based on his skill set as a highly experienced trial lawyer in Dallas, Texas. Robbie worked on a lot of different jury trials, 102 to be exact, within the first 7 years of his legal career. He initially started off working on violent felonies like robberies and murders before moving on to the Special Crimes Unit, focused on child abuse cases. Why that matters is because the stakes couldn't have been higher. And so it's really important to recognize that when we talk about storytelling and what Robbie will be sharing with us today, the importance of being able to use stories isn't just, oh, that's a nice little thing that you can do sometimes to make you a little bit more persuasive. You're using stories when the stakes are as high as they could possibly be. Robbie went from doing that to working in the startup world. He's worked with an enormous amount of different organizations and startups, helping them to be able to be as successful as possible at pitching to investors. And he's since helped them raise over $575 million as of June 2023, an incredible amount. After 7 years as a trial lawyer, by the way, he also coached the national mock trial team at SMU Law School while teaching trial advocacy. After 7 years of being a trial lawyer, Robbie decided to take on a new challenge and founded an ed tech startup around public speaking for a tech company executives and leadership, which was eventually acquired by On Deck at the end of 2020. Nowadays, like I said, Robbie helps organizations and startups to raise a ridiculous amount of money through mastering the power of what he calls competitive storytelling. His approach comes directly from his experience as a trial lawyer, where he's asked to speak around the world on the topic. He's spoken at Stanford University multiple times, where he's addressed the funding gap for minorities and female founders. And he also has provided a roadmap where he helps capital allocators and founders to change the dynamic. And so he helps people to be able to use their voice more powerfully. Robbie is someone I met at a mastermind. We both shared the stage. We spoke at the same event. I really learned a lot from Robbie. I found it there was so much overlap between myself and himself. He truly is a kindred spirit. So with that in mind, Robbie, thank you so much for taking the time to come and share your expertise with us on the Changing Minds podcast.
Great to be here, Owen. I have to say, I love the talk that you gave at the mastermind as well. It was one of those where you just hear it and you're like, yes, that's exactly what I've been thinking. Yes, that's how I feel. And some of my favorite books feel that way too, where you just read and you're just nodding along saying, yes, yes. And your talk was very much like that. So I agree. I think we very much are kindred spirits approaching a similar idea in different ways. And that's kind of the beauty of it all.
100%. And that's why I had to get you on the podcast. And I'm so delighted. Once again, loved listening to you. And therefore, I have a bunch of questions and would love to hear your perspective. First of all, though, Robbie, can you explain for everyone? I mean, I've given the highlight in terms of the bio. Could you walk us through what is it that you do specifically? We know you help our startup founders to raise investment, but what specifically, how do you do that? What's your job?
So my job is to come into a startup, scale up, whatever term of art you want to use, and work with the founder or the CEO to craft two core stories, as I think about it, the founder story and the vision story, help that founder to be able to deliver that story in a way that is going to inspire investors to come on board and say, like, I want to write you that check and be a part of this journey that you're talking about. And then finally, to understand how to run a fundraising process. And the reason this was important to add into the storytelling piece is I realized that fundraising looked very similar to a jury trial from end to end. And if a founder had the right story, that was great. If they knew how to tell the story, that was great. But if they didn't know how to get the investment across the finish line, that story just kind of died in the woods. It's kind of like a tree falls in the forest. No one's around to hear it. Did it really fall? And that's what would happen sometimes with these stories. So in order for them to really take root and grow, I said, I've got to help them actually get over the finish line. So I wanted to teach them from a trial lawyer's perspective, how do you influence people? How do you persuade them? How do you convince them to get to the outcome that you want? And that's really what I do with founders. to help them raise a lot of capital and then use that storytelling muscle in a lot of other ways as well once they raise the capital to continue building their company.
What I noticed and what I loved about hearing you talk about it, Robbie, and I also want to later on talk about your upcoming book, which I cannot wait to get my hands on it. I guarantee I'll have it read within the first 24 hours. What I wanted to mention is there's two mistakes I see people make, not just in terms of raising money or whatever as a startup, but also in terms of influence, persuasion, leadership, whatnot. When they talk about stories, first of all, some people don't really see the value in it. They're really focused on the old school method of, let me tell them all of the million reasons, the 7 billion reasons as to why they need to say yes. Let me give them all the statistics, the facts, the figures. Let me spend a copious amount of time telling them why I'm so great. And then once I've done that, they're going to say yes. And as we both know, being right is not enough. You have to create the right kind of emotion and desire and motivation for the person, as well as provide the logic. But the other thing, and this is one of the things that was so refreshing about listening to you, was sometimes people say, oh, I do storytelling. And yet when you actually listen to them, they don't really do any storytelling. In other words, they talk about stories, but they're not actually doing it, right? It's almost like this is a name I give to when I'm not being over the top logical. So in other words, there's no real deep content to it. What I loved about what you talked about, which is anyone who knows about storytelling knows it's not just about one story. It's not that you go and you tell this story and immediately people want to give you lots of money. You talk about a variety of different types of stories for the different types of situations and you dive into it. From your point of view, what's the biggest, or what are some of the biggest mistakes that you see people make that your approach helps them to avoid?
So you hit one of the big ones straight out of the gate, which is they don't value storytelling. And to be fair, I understand why this is the case because I fell into that trap myself. And that was really what led me down this rabbit hole. And now, what is truly an obsession of mine is I was trying a jury trial back in my eighth jury trial ever. So I was this young, cocky prosecutor. I thought I knew better than everybody. I was going up against this defense attorney who had just been like running through our office. Anyone who tried a case against him lost. And I had this great case. It was a slam dunk by all accounts. The facts, logic, everything, the law was there. It was driving while intoxicated. It was 0.13 blood. The legal limit is 0.08. He admitted to drinking. He didn't look very good on video. He admitted he shouldn't have been driving that night. By all accounts, this is a slam dunk guilty verdict. So I did exactly that. I just told a very logical, follow the law. I'm entitled to this outcome. Give it to me because of this fact, this fact, this fact. The defendant testified and told a story. The defense attorney got up in closing argument and told a story based off of that. And I still thought I'm in good shape. I'm going to get to go back to my office and brag to all my colleagues and be like, I'm better than you. Right. And let's just be honest. I was that cocky person who was like, I'm going to get to go back to my office and be like, I'm better than all of you. I took down the giant. And so the jury comes back after deliberating for about 30 minutes, which is a pretty fast verdict return, even in that kind of case, which normally is good for the prosecution. And I'm thinking, great, I did it. And all of a sudden the jury stands up and delivers the verdict and they say not guilty. And I was floored. I was like, what just happened? This doesn't make sense. It really did feel like I had been punched in the gut because I was all puffed up and then all of a sudden, boom, it's gone. And so I did something that changed the way that I thought about influence, persuasion, and storytelling specifically. I walked out as the jury walked out and they wanted to talk to the defendant. They asked him when they were leaving the courtroom, can we talk to you so and so? And so he walked out. I'm allowed to listen. There's no reason that I can't. And I listened to what they said. And they said something that was super important. They said, young man, you know that you were guilty and we know that you were guilty. But we believed you and felt your story when you told us you wanted a second chance. And we wanted to give that to you. So I walked up to them and I'm like, hold on, did you just say that you knew he was guilty and you still voted not guilty? And the response to me was, yes, Robbie, because we felt bad for him and we think that he can do better. Whereas like you were right about the facts, but it just wasn't enough. Like we were never going to find him guilty based on what we heard from him. And I tell this story because that was the moment that I realized being right is not enough. And it stuck with me because I knew the trajectory of my career was going to go into violent felonies like murders and robberies and violent assaults and people who had been paralyzed or run over And ultimately, it was going to go into child abuse cases and capital murders and things where I was trying to save people from serious, serious harm. And if I failed in those situations, that was unacceptable. It was like, it wasn't great to fail in a DWI, driving while intoxicated, but nobody got hurt. Nobody died. No one was going to look at me and be like, Robbie, you failed us. But in the bigger cases, that was going to be the case. And so this is why I say that opened up my eyes in terms of why storytelling matters. And it matters because people make decisions based on emotion. You know this, Owen, and you talk about this all the time. They make it with emotion and they back it up with the logic. And if we go back to Aristotle's Art of Rhetoric and that ethos, logos, and pathos, people focus too much on the ethos and the logos, the credibility, the authority, the logic, and the reason. They don't focus on emotion. Whereas everything that I think about when I work with a founder is how do we create the emotion first? How do we build the credibility in so the emotion gets tied into that where they're like, yeah, I get why this is lining up. And then we give a little bit of logic at the end to just give them enough to say, yeah, I want to be a part of this thing. So I think that's a big difference in terms of how I approach it versus others where just like, well, if I just give you all the facts, if I just put them in an order, people think putting facts in an order makes it a story, which it doesn't. If there's no, go ahead.
No, exactly. I was just going to say that's another thing. It's like, let me lay it out to you in terms of what happened. Now I'm using storytelling. And I'm like, well, that's not storytelling because in storytelling, there's an actual arc, there's changes that happen. The character goes through a certain, I suppose, experience that creates a transformation. And accordingly, that's the suggestion. One thing I want to pick up on, which I'd love your perspective on. So as you were talking, as you were giving the example, which I love, of the trial case, I was thinking about the ethos, pathos, and logos piece, right? Aristotle's trilogy. And in it, when we talk about, I would actually go as far as saying the following, that while people focus a lot of times on ethos and logos and ignore pathos, which is something that, like you, I say all the time, I also think a big part of potentially even a jury trial was also connected to ethos. In other words, the story, or in your case, the origin story, part of it is getting them to believe in the message, get to believe in the idea. But a big part of it is also a form of ethos. It's getting them to believe in the person. So they might not have, for example, they believed in this guy's potential to do good. They still felt the need to talk to him, but they believed that he was sorry that he did what he did. And maybe the fact that you, as you, I suppose, pointed out, you were in there to win. You were, I'm entitled to this and this and that and the other. You might have personified for them. There was still a story there that they told themselves about you, which is this guy thinks he knows this guy thinks he's all the facts. And it's almost like it could do, and I know you're a likable person, so it might not be this extreme, but it could be, I don't want to say yes to you, even though you're logically right, because the story I'm telling myself about you positions you as someone that I don't want to say yes to. And this other guy who seems humble and contrite, and I'm sorry, I'm telling myself a story that they want to make a change, and I have the chance, as a jury, we have the chance to give a difference. Would that be fair, or do you think there's a mistake there?
No, I think that's totally fair. In fact, when I'm working with a startup and a founder, I think about creating the frame where they need to answer, like they need to create a frame using three different parts. And the story is designed to do this. This is actually where I think about storytelling. A lot of people look at storytelling like the purpose of storytelling is to create emotion that inspires action. And that's 100% right on a surface level. But if we go deeper, we have to understand what are we trying to like achieve in terms of like what is the emotion we want to create and what is the action we want to drive? Because just being like we want to create emotion to create action doesn't get us where we want to go. Instead, you have to think about it much deeper. And this is where I think about the frame that I want the story to create. And when it comes to founders, I think about the frame as what if I'm right? That's the first piece that we're trying to get an investor to think through when we tell a story. What if we're painting that future version of reality, an alternative reality that do you think that this is possible? If they think it's possible, not that it's a sure thing, just that it's possible. So what if I'm right? And they're like, maybe he could be. Great. Now the second piece of that frame. So the first piece is what if I'm right? The second piece of the frame now goes into, can it be large enough? Like, does it make sense to invest in this? Is the reward great enough? Again, this goes into, again, the emotion piece of it all, right? Because that's going to inspire that sense of greed, if you will, fear of missing out, all these different emotions that we can trigger at that point. And the third piece that we drive into is, do you think that I'm the person, if I'm the founder, to pull this off? Or if I'm working with the founders, do you think that you are the person to pull this off? And That is the ethos part, right? Because we have to build that founder into that ethos, into that authority figure saying, this is the type of person who could pull off that crazy thing you just heard. And that goes exactly into the ethos because then the investors start thinking to themselves, yeah, like this story makes sense with this person who's telling it to me. And all of a sudden it can really take hold. And in that trial story, the problem is I didn't create any of that ethos around me. I told them I'm a prosecutor. You have to listen to me. I know the law. I'm entitled to this. What kind of credibility and authority does that create for me? None. It creates that I'm kind of a jerk in so many ways. And now that's not to say that there aren't times where being a jerk can play to your favor. This is why I say storytelling is so much deeper in terms of thinking through the levels beyond just create emotion to drive action.
I love that. And in particular, I love the fact that sequentially it lines up very much whenever I'm teaching people to pitch effectively. And a lot of times I'll go to the whole, what's the problem? Then what are the consequences if you don't fix the problem? Then what's the solution? Then how great can it be? And all that stuff. But where I go in common with you is I always suggest going to your credibility after you've talked about what's relevant to them. So I see a lot of times with people, not just in terms of startups, but they pitch, they spend a copious amount of time talking about their company and talking about this, talking about that. I'm like, the listeners don't care. What they want to know is, like in an investor's case, I presume it's like, what is the idea? And what is the problem you're solving with this? How needed is this in the marketplace? And then they ask the question, are you the person to pull it off? But if you start out of the trap and you're talking about yourself and stuff like that, unless it's, as you would put it, an origin story where you're connecting the relevancy of why you're the person talking about it to that specific issue, then great. But if you're not spending the first few minutes talking about I'm this, I'm this, I'm this, it doesn't do enough, you know?
If you're going to go with the origin story first, which you can, you need to make sure that it is checking certain psychological hooks or certain pattern matching components that an investor is looking for. So investors will look for things like, is this person a builder? Have they ever built something before? Is this person, have they ever been top 1% of something? Like, it doesn't matter what that thing is. Just like, do they have that level of drive and ability to reach the top of something? And we start to do these sort of things. So like sometimes it's they're a super high level violinist. Sometimes it's they built a Minecraft server to millions of users. Sometimes it's they had a successful business when they were 15 years old. Sometimes it's, they competed in CrossFit and were sponsored by Nike. Sometimes it can be they tried 102 jury trials. It doesn't matter what it is, but like investors are looking for this. So if we're going to create an origin story, the origin story has to check the boxes that an investor is looking for so that it sets the frame of, okay, this is a type of founder who I should pay attention to. So again, even in that origin story, while yes, we're building the ethos, we're also playing into the pathos as well, because we're creating that emotional response of, oh, okay, I know this type of founder. There might be something here that's for me, because even though we're not talking about the business yet, we've still made it about the investor because they know a great founder is their highest likelihood of getting a payback on that investment. So it depends. Now, other founders where maybe they don't have as many of those things to check in that origin story, we might need to start with what I would call like a vision first story where we set the big vision to excite them. And then we say, oh, by the way, here's why I can do this. And so this is why storytelling, there's certainly science behind storytelling, but storytelling at its core is an art form because it's a feel, it changes. And we have to be flexible enough to live in that chaos and chase the muse to find that perfect story to bring it to life so it connects. And that's the hardest piece to get. That's one of the biggest misunderstandings of storytelling. People think, well, the hero's journey, I just do the hero's journey and I'm good. It's like, there's so much more. Like you got to go so much deeper than just the hero's journey, my friends.
But the other good news is that's also why ChatGPT is going to take a lot longer to catch up with us because part of it, as you said, is an art form and it's almost like a taste. It's getting the sense that you're on track. Are there some questions, Robbie? Because this is so useful, not just for startup founders, but for any entrepreneur. In fact, anyone who wants to improve their personal brand, even people on dates, for goodness sake. So with an origin story, what are the core questions that you should be looking to ask or answer? And how would you go about doing it? Let's say someone wanted to create a decent enough origin story. What would be some of the questions you get them to answer and what would the process look like?
Three very simple questions, open ended, that's going to give a lot of self discovery. How did you get here? Why do you care? what makes you special. Those are very broad, and that's by design because an origin story is a process of self discovery. And what I tell anyone to do is turn on a voice recorder. It can be Loom, it can be Otter, it can be video, it can just be voice, and just talk and answer those questions and let the transcript flow. And once the transcript is done answering all of that, go back and look at the transcript, read it, and start highlighting the pieces that you think are the most interesting and get rid of everything else. Just delete everything you don't highlight. And you'll probably go from maybe 10 pages down to 4 pages of highlights, let's say. And then your goal is to see how does it all match up? How can I create a narrative that is somewhere in the neighborhood? I like to think about 400 to 600 words because that's going to be around 3-ish minutes, which is a nice length of time for a story where people will listen. It gives enough depth, but not too much. And so then you just distill it down into that 400 to 600 words. And is it going to be perfect at first? No. And in fact, you might have different versions of the origin story depending on who you're talking to, what the audience is like, what you're trying to achieve. And then you get out there and you just test it and you share it and you see how people respond to it. And then you start making those changes and it evolves and it grows and you get more comfortable with it and you internalize it and it just gets better and better over time. And so that's how I would go about creating it. And that last piece, the 400 to 600 words, I call that storytelling density. And the way I tell people to do it is literally do it line by line. Like I call it an A through W format, where I'm just like, make it like line A is a line, B line, C line. That way, each line is meant to move through the story with as much weight as possible. Because when we tend to write prose, we make it flowery and flowy, and there's a lot of fluff. And this is a way to take all that out. And then you just add in the transitions to make it a little bit smoother and iron out those rough edges.
You also have a great graph, which you call, at the moment, it's called the U-shaped graph. And it's something that obviously anyone who's teaching or training for a while is familiar with, but it's a beautiful way of putting it. Could you share, and this is specifically with, how do you get comfortable with saying your, let's say, origin story, and this could be used for an elevator pitch as well, or the vision story, whatnot. But how do you get comfortable with it to the point that it doesn't sound like you're like reading off ChatGPT? So what is it that you can do to make it more natural? And you've got a great graph that kind of you use to help people understand this concept.
Terrible name for the concept, but that's okay. It sticks. The U-shaped graph approach. That's what we've come up with. So what is when somebody, if I ask someone to tell me their origin story right now, and they've never done any work with me, never prepared anything, they're going to sound natural, but sloppy. That's just the way it's going to be. So that is at like the top left, right? And what we do then by creating an origin story is by making that origin story, it becomes less sloppy. But as someone is trying to embody that story and stay true to the written out version of this, they start to sound robotic. It sounds rehearsed, right? So they go down this U, if you will, from natural but sloppy, and they move down, and now it's becoming more polished but less natural. So more rehearsed. And at the bottom of the U, it's starting to sound polished, but the person that's talking it out loud feels really gross because they're like, it sounds like I'm a robot. It sounds like I'm reading. It sounds like it's a script. It sounds like it's rehearsed. And you know what? They're right. Because at that point, all they've done is memorize it. And there is a difference between memorizing and internalizing. And this U-shaped graph approach is designed to help somebody internalize that story. So by going to the bottom, if you keep pushing through, you will drive up and to the right. And when you get up and to the right, you have fully internalized that story, which means now it is polished, but you sound natural because you have taken that into your being. And now it's no longer just this thing that you create over here. That is your story and you've taken full ownership over it. And that's where I can wake somebody up in the middle of the night and they could tell me their origin story perfectly. And nobody would think, oh, that was rehearsed or that was scripted because it sounds natural. That's the magic of that U-shaped graph approach.
When you said that, I was thinking about my TEDx talk, because normally I'm very sort of natural in terms of I speak a lot off the cuff and I suppose go back in my own mind and try to answer whatever questions I'm asked at the time. I don't generally use notes and I don't memorize things. But when I did my TEDx talk, because it was the whole time thing was done in rhyme for 10 minutes, I had to really internalize it. And so people ask me, what did you do in order to get it? So once I'd written it, I literally had to go over and over and over again to the point that initially I was there. It was polished, but it sounded very like da 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 da, very like over the top poetic. And then when I kept going to the point that I would be going for a run and I'd be repeating it out loud, I'd be going for a shower. Everything I did was trying to get to that stage where it was internalized. So on the night, and thank goodness it worked out well, it wasn't the case that people will say, how did you remember it? It wasn't just about remembering it. It was remembering it so well that my delivery sounded like I was coming up with the ideas on the spot. And I think that's not just true for whenever you're learning off something, it could be your like one liner and pitch. So I love that. And I think it's one of the best explanations I've heard to describe it. And that process you go through the whole unconscious incompetence to unconscious competence. You also talk about a vision story, Robbie. And this is, again, I find a number of interesting nuances to the way you describe it. Could you talk through the power of a vision story, what it means, how someone could start to get better at that? Is there any hacks, like questions you have? And then finally, you talk about a concept I love, which I hadn't heard of before, but makes sense, which is the notion of inevitability.
Mm.
And I love that concept. Could you share just a little bit of how do we create visions? What do you mean by inevitability? What is a vision story?
I think a lot of this comes from the fact that I loved sci-fi, fantasy, historical fiction growing up. And so I just read a lot of these worlds that weren't real, but when I'd read them, they felt like they were real, right? And when you live in that space, all of a sudden your brain just starts thinking, oh, okay, this is just how you build worlds. And yet so many people don't spend any time doing that. And as a result, they don't understand their ability when they tell a story to create this alternative future, if we will. And so when I think about the vision story, that's really what we're doing is we are world building a future world and saying, this is what it looks like. This is what it feels like. This is why you want to be involved in it. What we do there to help somebody get their mind around that idea is ask a very simple question, but again, powerful in its simplicity. What is the biggest, boldest, most ambitious vision of the future that you have? And since I'm working mostly with founders, that question is around their company, right? What is the biggest, boldest, most ambitious future in 10 years, 5 years, whatever time domain you want to work in of your company? What does that look like? What does that feel like? What are the first order consequences of that? What are the second order consequences of that? What are the third order consequences of that? Really think through it and build out that entire world. By doing this, we can get into that visualization piece of the brain, right? If our brain can visualize something, we can make it come to life. And we can also, it feels real to us. So I'm a huge believer in visualization, really getting into that work so we can see it come to life so that we can then just like map it out and build it. So when I'm working with a founder on building out the vision story, once we identify that's the question to answer, and then we come up with the vision, the reason why we're so focused on making it feel inevitable is because that is what transfers conviction over to somebody who's listening to it, who says, this thing's happening. I need to be involved. And we do that by speaking it in such a way as though that future already exists. Right. And it's removing words like we're trying to build X, instead, just being like, we're building A, B, and C. Well, in 5 years, we already know that we're going to have 7.5 million users on our platform. And here's what that looks like on a daily basis when they're interacting with one another. I'm just talking about it like it is a thing. And what we do is we build out that future. Now, we also, in order to build a future, what we do a lot of is also tying into the past and building analogies and bridges, because we need somebody to understand what happened in the past in order to understand what happened in the future. One of my favorite speeches of all time, in fact, I think it's the greatest technology speech that's ever been created, is JFK's "We'll Put a Man on the Moon" speech. And a lot of times we have to get investors to understand, like, yes, we're telling you that there are going to be steps that we have to figure out before we even get to the big vision. But you know why we know this is going to work? Because back in 1962, this is exactly what JFK said at Rice University. When he said, we're going to put a man on the moon and bring them back safely. And oh, by the way, we're going to have to invent metals and alloys in order to do that first, which we don't even know how to do yet, but we'll figure it out. And so we do this parallel building out that world, but also tying it into things that make sense, analogies. Maybe it's in the past, maybe it's sci-fi, maybe it's something else. And that's where the vision has to be brought to life in a very controlled way because we can't just be like, we're going to build a flying car. My favorite example of the wrong way of doing this is the flying car example. Flying cars make sense to us. We've seen them in movies. We understand what it would look like. Except the flying car has not been able to been built in 40 plus years since we've been seeing this idea because the technology is so complicated. No one's been able to figure it out up to this point. So sometimes we have to be able to dive into that future vision. We have to tie it into something that makes it feel tangible as well. And this actually goes into like a State of the Union address. If you look at a State of the Union address, they always do like this big policy idea. It's this like very general idea. And then they point it to the stands and they say, look at so-and-so who's up here today because they're a teacher in such and such place and they need these supplies so they can provide care to their students. And they make it real. They make it tangible. Right. And so that's what we have to do as well when we're building the vision story. Set this big vision, world build, and then tie it into the tangible so somebody feels like it's real. That's what makes it inevitable. And then ultimately, that's what enables them to get on board with what we're doing.
There's so many more questions, Robbie. I'll just have a couple more before we go into the lightning round because I value your time very much and love to have you back on the podcast as well. So got to leave plenty, although no shortage of plenty of questions I have for you. What are some of the qualities of great storytellers? What are some of the skills that as you work with founders, for example, you're trying to get them? Maybe some of the same skills you would have worked with, when you're coaching law students. What are the kinds of things that you try to help people to master when they're telling stories?
The biggest thing that I'm looking for in a storyteller is can they transfer emotion from themselves to somebody else? And this is something that requires the ability to be both external to yourself and internal at the same time. External meaning you're paying attention to what the audience is doing and you're paying attention to who you're speaking to and you're involved in that process. But you're also internal and reliving that story or that piece of you that you're sharing. And what I mean is, even when I was telling you, I'll go back to the earlier example, when I was telling you the story of that eighth jury trial that I lost, I'm obviously talking to you because I'm trying to make a point about why, like one of the mistakes people make around storytelling. So like that's the external focus is, can I highlight a point that I want to make using a story that I have from my own past? But then when I'm telling that story, I'm reliving that story. Like I am inside feeling that story. I can still remember exactly what that defendant looks like, what that defense attorney looks like, what those jurors look like. I can remember the hallway that we had that conversation. And when I'm telling that story, I am feeling every moment of it. In fact, right now, as I talk about it, it is making me angry thinking about the fact that I lost that case in that way. And it's that sort of thing that you see in great storytellers where they're able to blend that external with the internal. And the only reason they're able to do that is because they've spent the time building the foundational skills that allow them to not have to be solely focused on the external. What we see from good storytellers versus great or world class is the good storyteller has to only focus on the content that they're delivering. They want to make sure that they say the right thing in the right way. Whereas the person who is great or world class is no longer worried about saying the right thing or the right way because they have created those conditions where it's just muscle memory, where I know when I'm doing a rule of three that I know when I want to like hit something faster, do a staccato burst, or if I want to slow down and really create drama in it. I don't need to think about it because I just do it. And from there, because I just do it, then I can go into that emotional piece, that internal piece that allows me to really do this. And this is why the building a world-class storyteller is not an overnight exercise, just like building a world-class athlete isn't an overnight exercise, just like building a world-class musician isn't an overnight exercise. And so that's why I say it's the people that I know are going to be great storytellers are the ones who can tap into that emotion, but also understand that this is a journey that's going to take time to get to those levels because you have to have that mastery of the external before you can even really get into that internal piece, which is really what elevates things.
It's amazing how aligned that is with like a lot of the work I do. I wrote a book called The Charismatic Edge, and the elements of becoming more charismatic is made up of authenticity and expressivity. So authenticity is the internal confidence you have, the ability you have to be comfortable with who you are so you can allow people to see that you. And the expressivity is when you do that to fully engage in that so that you're impacting people more. When you talked about the emotional piece, and there's obviously the emotional contagion, this notion that our feelings are contagious and they influence people. But what's great about it is that, as you pointed out, when you go into that, like the way I like to think about it, and let me know if this resonates with you, it's when I'm telling a story, I'm not telling it and I'm not even showing it. I'm dragging people into it. So the metaphor I use is when I'm on stage, I don't want you to feel like you're hearing a story or even you're seeing a story. I want you to feel like you're part of the story. I want you to be in my shoes. I want you to feel what I felt. And that therefore, when I'm doing it like you, I'm not thinking about now I'm going to do this. Now I'm going to pause. One, two, three. Like all of that becomes a natural part of the way in which I'm functioning because I'm so invested in bringing you into the world. And I think that's what the great screenwriters talk about as well. I'd love to ask you about competitive storytelling. That is the name of your book. That is the name of the approach that you use. Tell us, first of all, why competitive storytelling, and then please share what are all the things that I'm going to love reading about in the book.
I love how you broke that piece down, Owen, because it's exactly this goes back to when I was a trial lawyer, which ties into your question now. But this is exactly what I wanted to do. When I would tell the opening statement to my jury, I wanted them to feel like they were seeing that story in real time. I wanted them in the story. And I always told when I was coaching the national mock trial team and teaching at SMU Law School, I would tell a lot of the students I was working with, be comfortable playing with perspective. The story can be told from a house's perspective. A story can be told from a child's perspective. A story can be told from the victim's perspective, from the defendant's perspective. You can tell it through different perspectives, and you can switch those perspectives inside of a story so that the jury, in my case, feels like they are experiencing it. And one of the hardest pieces about my job, especially as a child abuse prosecutor, is I knew if I did my job right, most of my jury was going to end up needing therapy because it was that dark and it was going to be that traumatic for them to live. But I knew that if I did that, I would win and that would bring justice to the victim. And so this brings me to why the book is called Competitive Storytelling, is because when people would ask me what it was like being a trial lawyer, I would tell them it is a game of competitive storytelling. I sit in a courtroom with the other side. I tell a story, they tell a story, the jury decides which one was better. Which one do I believe more? Which one is the one that I'm going to vote for? And if I did my job and told the best story, I won the case. And that is a cold way to look at being a trial lawyer, especially given the cases that I was dealing with, but it is the reality. Now, are there other pieces that go into that? Like we've talked about brain science and human nature and psychology and all these different things, of course. But at the end of the day, if I told the best story, I won. There was nothing else there. So what I did in the book too is because so much of what I learned around storytelling came from those years in a courtroom, because yes, I tried 102 jury trials. I also was in a courtroom 200 days a year for 7 years because I was arguing every single day. If I wasn't in trial, I was arguing in front of a judge. And so I was constantly practicing this and developing it. And what the book goes into is looking at the process to go from good to great storyteller, somebody who doesn't have a great handle on storytelling to really mastering it. And that means knowing what actually moves people in storytelling, knowing what stories to share and how to build them out, knowing how to deliver them, how to think about rhetoric and oratory, the delivery pieces, how to think about 10-word storytelling or conversational storytelling, like I talked about. And the book does that by using each chapter where I dive into a trial that I had as a trial lawyer and look through that lens of here's what was going on in this trial. Here's what I learned. Here's what you can take away from this as well. And so the book really dives into blending that world of a trial lawyer to founders, executives, entrepreneurs, people in this space who need to use storytelling in the same ways because the stakes may not be life in prison. They may not be to that extreme, but we are talking about the success of your business, the ability to raise capital, the ability to lead your company to a successful IPO, things that influence a lot of people because you can create a lot of value. You have people who rely on you, jobs. You can make millions, billions of dollars if you want to. And so that's really what the book gets into is how can you take those things that I learned over 7 years inside of a courtroom and now what I've learned in the last 3 years building an ed tech and then also working with founders, how can you get that knowledge base transferred to you so you don't have to spend 20 years like I have in this world in order to fully understand it.
I'm so excited. And for everyone, it's available to pre order now. It'll be out tomorrow as you listen to this. So I'm very excited. Can't wait to get my hands on it. And I know it's going to be spectacular. Let's go into the, by the way, for anyone who does want it, where do they go? Amazon?
They can go to Amazon and order it directly there. If they need any other help, they can always reach out to me. I'm sure we'll put ways to get in contact.
Exactly. Yeah, I'll definitely make sure all that's in the show notes. Quick fire round. First of all, favorite movie?
Gladiator,
Amazing. Favorite author?
Stephen Pressfield,
Wonderful author. Favorite book?
Dune.
Favorite artist, as in painter, sculptor, artist type?
My favorite piece of art is Wing Victory in the Louvre. But if I were to say the one that probably influences me the most would be Michelangelo and the way that he approached the David sculpture, because I think that it's just the most perfect breakdown of what art looks like.
Love it. Favorite musician or band?
Funny enough, I would say growing up, I was just an Eminem fan and I just loved the way that he understood words and knew how to put raps together. And that was really me growing up. So I always have a soft spot for Eminem and just his obsession with the craft too. So I think that one has always spoken to me and I'll go with Eminem.
Yeah, he's a genius. Favorite philosopher?
I mean, it's hard for me to go against somebody like an Aristotle, given what I study. And so, whether you consider him a philosopher or not, I don't know, but I'm going to go with Aristotle, given that he focuses so much on rhetoric.
I also just want to mention briefly, because we've talked about this before, you're also a huge fan of, and I put him in the philosopher category, but it's just because there's no other category, Anthony Bourdain.
Anthony Bourdain, and one other that I don't think most people put in the philosopher category, but I think he actually is Mike Tyson,
There you go. There you go. Favorite TV series?
West Wing.
Phenomenal. Desired superpower. If you could have any superpower, what would it be?
Whoa, that's a challenge. What would be my desired superpower? I think I'd want to read minds because again, given what I do, that would make things so much easier if I knew exactly what was going on.
Time travel, past or future. When would you go?
I would go to the past and I believe I would go to when Julius Caesar crossed the Rubicon and try to learn like what was going on in his head as he was making that decision and kind of how everybody reacted in ancient Rome to that decision.
Phenomenal. I love that. If you could live anywhere besides where you're living, where would you live?
I think I live in Florence. I love that city. I think it's just beautiful. Plus, I'm a big fan too of Brunelleschi's dome there in Florence and also of the Medici and how they inspired a lot of artists and gave them that kind of free reign. In fact, I have a theory that the Medici were really the first venture capitalists in the world because they backed Brunelleschi's dome, which seemed impossible, except somehow he pulled it off.
I love it. Fantastic. If you could do any other job besides what you're doing, what would you be doing?
I don't know. I don't have like a thing that I would love to do otherwise. But if I was going to say like my dream growing up was I wanted to be a professional athlete. So if I were to look at it now, like when I was a kid, I wanted to be a professional basketball player, then a professional baseball player. If I were looking at today, though, as crazy as it sounds, I think I'd want to be a professional surfer. I just think that's a very interesting, cool life.
Yeah. Yeah. Very cool. Last question for you, Robbie. One piece of advice for the world, fit on a billboard. If you were to give a message to everyone, what would the message be?
The world runs on the best stories, so it might as well be yours.
Love it. Where can people find out more about you, mate?
Competitivestorytelling.co. That is the homepage for us. They can follow me on LinkedIn. We post a lot of content there. We have a YouTube channel as well. On my LinkedIn or on my website, you can find our newsletter, which we send out occasionally to keep people updated on things and break down some storytelling stuff. But those are the main sources to get in touch or follow what we're doing.
I'm on your newsletter list. I love getting your emails every Sunday. Find them. Always love to read them. So I highly recommend all of those ways. And thank you so much, mate. Honestly, I could talk to you for hours. I love this stuff and we're just so aligned in so many ways. It's a pleasure. Thank you so much for coming on and sharing all your wisdom. And I can't wait to get my hands on your book tomorrow.
Appreciate it, Owen. Thanks so much, man. This was great.
Take it easy, brother.